begin here. We are on Daf, obviously Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph in Masechta Beitza, and here we begin the Mishnah. Now, just to recap, you know that Oichel Nefesh is permitted on Yontif, correct? But not every Oichel Nefesh did they allow you to do on Yontif. In other words, if it was something that could have been done before Yontif, so then you just can't, save it to be done on Yontif. And the perfect example would be, let's say, pepper, crushing pepper. So that could have been done before. And that's what we're dealing with here in the Mishnah. Let's say a person wants pepper in his soup. So what's the din of something? This is something that could have been done before Yontif. The problem with pepper is that if you do it before Yontif, it loses some of its taste. So therefore, there's an opinion of Beis Shammai and there's an opinion of Beis Hillel. But take, for example, salt. Salt, you could do it a week before and it won't lose its taste. So really, why would you crush salt and do a malacha, which is something that you could have done before Yontif? So therefore, there's an Issur D'Rabbanan, maybe Issur D'Oraisa to do it. So let's learn the Mishnah. One thing I will tell you, again, Oichel Nefesh is permitted, but under no circumstances can you take wheat and start grinding, winnowing it and threshing it and grinding it, because wheat is generally done in huge quantities that nobody says is permitted to be done in Yontif. So, but again, slaughtering, yes, because they wanted you to eat fresh meat on Yontif. They didn't have refrigeration. So it's all subjective over here. So let's read the Mishnah. Beis Shammai said, Tavalim, spices. Let's use the example of pepper. So since technically you could have done the grounding of the spices before Yontif, so therefore you waited to Yontif to do it. So I could understand why you waited to Yontif, because it loses some of its taste if you do it before Yontif. So therefore, Beis Shammai holds nidoichim b'madoich shel eitz. You have to use a mortar of wood. So like this is how they would right here's the picture. So according to Beis Shammai, you would have to, instead of normally they use stone and stone, a mortar of stone, a pestle of stone. But according to Beis Shammai, the mortar should be made out of wood. So that's like a shinui. So you're doing something different. V'hamelech. But if you're coming to grind salt, well, salt, for sure you should have done it before Yontif. So they're not going to give you permission to do it on Yontif. So b'pach, you have to use either a wooden spoon to crush the salt, or this is sometimes, or ube'etz ha'para. Papach means, papach is like a bowl made of earthenware bowl, ube'etz ha'para, or a wooden spatula. That's what Beis Shammai holds. So Beis Shammai holds with salt, either use a bowl of cheres, not the normal tool that's used, and also, or you could use a wooden spatula to crush the salt. A real shinoi. That's like totally different than you do it all week. Beis Hillel says no. Tavalin, spices like pepper, since you have a reason why you waited to Yontif, so nidoichin kedarkon, you can crush it the way you normally crush it during the weekdays. But modach shel even, with a pestle and a mortar, all made of stone, the normal way. But salt, even Beis Hillel says, why did you wait till Yontif to do it? Here, he'll say, do it with a shinui kitzatz. Use the pestle, the bowl should be made of stone, but use b'madoich shel eitz. The mortar should be made of wood. Okay? So, the Gemara begins, the Kuli Alme, everybody agrees, Mias Melech Boyeshninui, that when you're coming to crush salt on Yontif, since you could have done it before Yontif, even Beis Hillel requires you to do it with a shinui, doing it in a different manner. Beis Hillel says you do it in a slightly different manner, and Beis Shammai says do it in a completely different manner by using, let's say, a wooden spatula. But still, everybody agrees that you need to do a shinui. So the Gemara asks the question, my tama, what's the reason? Why can't I crush salt on Yontif? It's oichel nefesh. The Torah says anytime you want to do oichel nefesh, it's permitted to be done on Yontif. So the Gemara says, Rav Huna, Rav Chizda. That's an argument between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. Chad Amar once said, Kol hakadeus kulin srichas melech. Every food that you were going to make on Yontif, you knew needs salt. Ve'ein kol hakaderes tzrichos tavlan, and not every dish needs spices. So I have an excuse. Salt, you knew you were going to use salt on Yantif, so why didn't you crush it before Yantif? That's why even Beis Hillel agrees you should do it in a different manner. But spices, not everybody's doesn't know what kind of dishes he's going to work up on Yantif. He didn't know he was going to need spices. So that's why spices is always a little more lenient than salt. And that's why Beis Hillel says with spices, you don't even need a shinui at all. And Beis Shammai says do a shinui ktsas, a slight derivation. The other reason says, kol hatvola mefigen taman. Any type of spice that you prepare before Yom Tov loses its potency. It's not as strong as when you do it right away, and therefore, I understand why spices you want to crush it only on the Yom Tov. Umelach, but salt, eina mefiga tama. There's no reason why you waited till Yom Tov to do it. It doesn't lose its taste, so you should have done it prior to Yom Tov. Again, Chazal didn't want you to overwork on Yom Tov, and to save all your work to be done on Yom Tov. So do some preparation of food before Yom Tov. So we have two reasons why salt needs a shinui. Either it's because you knew you were going to use salt, or there was no reason why you shouldn't have prepared the salt because it would not lose its potency. My benaya, what's the difference between these two reasons? I'll give you a difference between the two reasons. The Yoda Ma Kadera Boiler Vashula. If you had a menu before Yom Tiv and you knew what type of pots, what type of dishes you're going to work up, what you're going to cook up in Yom Tiv, so then even spices you should have prepared before Yom Tiv. According to that reason, according to the first reason, then you would need a shinui even for spices, because if you had a menu and you knew you're going to have spice, you're going to need spices on Yom Tiv, you should have prepared it before Yom Tiv. And according to the second lashon, no, the reason why you didn't prepare it before Yom Tiv is because it would have lost its potency. Inami, another difference would be bamarika, a type of spice like a saffron or something like that, that even if you prepared it before Yom Tiv, it would not have lost its taste. So that case, according to the first lashon, if you didn't know exactly what you're going to cook, so then this spice, because you didn't know what you're going to need it, you're allowed to crush it on Yom Tov normally. But according to the second reason, still, since it wouldn't have lost its potency before Yom Tov, you should have crushed it before Yom Tov. Next piece of Gemara. So we said by salt, you need a shinui. Now we're going to have a new opinion over here that even by salt, you don't even need a shinui at all. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Kol hanidoichin, anything that you need to crush, nidoichin kedarkan, can be crushed normally. Filamelech, even salt. Now, that's very different than our Mishnah. Our Mishnah seemed to imply that even Beis Hillel holds that by crushing salt, you have to do it in a slight derivation. So the Gemara asks Gemara's question, Amrit melech bo yeshinui. We said in our Mishnah that salt needs a shinui. And says the Gemara, Shmuel, who said, Tana. He was following this opinion of what the version of machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is, because that's our Mishnah's version. But there is another version what the argument is. The Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Amir Meir said that Lo nechleku Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel al hanidoichem. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel don't have an argument regarding things that you need to crush. That it's crushed in the normal manner, and spices and salt amongst that. In other words, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that spices you can crush on Yom Tov normally. Nobody argues what that. And if you put salt with the spices together, you can crush them both. What is the machlokes then? Can you crush salt by itself? So Beis Shammai is strict when it comes to salt, only when it comes to salt. Beis Shammai melech b'pach. Melech you use an earthenware keli, an earthenware pestle, ube'etz hapara, and you use a spatula, or litzali, and you do a little at a time, like the amount of salt you need to roast meat, which is less than the amount of salt that you used to cook a dish of not the kind of salt that you would use for a dish, where there for roasted meat you don't need that much salt because the roasting itself takes out the blood, but for using meat for a kedera you need a lot of salt. So there Beis Shammai did not give you any leniency for that. Beis Hillel, you you can use it for anything, even something that's even a machine. You're allowed to. The Gemara says you're allowed to crush salt with any item, even with a machine, electric machine. So the Gemara says, "B'chol davar sal kadaita." Can you think that Beis Hillel will allow you to use an item that's not allowed to be turned on Yom Tov or Shabbos? How could you say you could crush salt using a big tool for it? You're allowed to crush salt for any type of food that you're going to want to eat, even if you're going to be cooking the meat. So therefore, we find here the way Reb Meir's version is that Beis Hillel was very lenient even by salt. And the salt, he said, you don't have to, if you want to crush salt, you can crush salt with a mortar and pestle, even by itself. And Beis Shammai is also pretty lenient because Beis Shammai would hold, according to Reb Meir's version, that spices you could crush, and salt, you do a little shinoi over here. You do a shinoi. So the Gemara says, Alma le Rav Acha Bardala Levrei. Rav Acha Bardala said to his son, when you, although the halacha is like Beis Hillel, right, that you're allowed to crush salt for anything, kidaikas, but he told the son, when you crush the salt, atzluye v'doich, tilt it over to the side, tilt the pestle over on its end, and then crush it. Do some sort of shinoi. Don't just, take a big piece of salt and say, oh, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, let's crush it. He says you should be machmer even with salt to tilt the vessel, the pestle off on its side. Rav Sheshes Shama Kal Bichna. Rav Sheshes, as he was walking home, and I think Rav Sheshes was blind, if I'm not mistaken. So he had a very good sense of hearing. And so look how the Gemara describes. He hears a sound of crushing, right? Somebody's crushing salt. Amal, he said, Hi la migavai de basaihu. This is not from my house. It's not from my house because I know that I told them to use, I never allowed anybody in my house to use a pestle made of stone. If they're going to crush, they're using wood. So it doesn't make that kind of a sound. So the Gemara says, okay, you heard a different sound, the dilma atzluye atzle, but maybe the people in your house are actually bending it and they're doing it on a tilt. So that's why he didn't hear such a clear sound. So, and for the Gemara, the Shama, the Havetzlu Klali, he did hear a clear sound. So he knew that somebody's crushing something in the normal manner, and he determined it was salt. So what he heard was somebody banging salt in the normal manner. And he said, that can't be my house. I never gave permission to anybody to crush salt in the normal manner. Even though, like I said, according to a mayor's opinion, Beis Hillel would allow that. Rav Sheshes was machmir. So the Gemara says, how do you know that the Gemara is questioning? How did Rav Sheshes know they were crushing salt? Maybe he was heard that they're crushing spices. And spices, we learned that even Beis Shammai is very makel. You could crush spices in the normal way, right? So how did he know that they were crushing salt? And he said, this is not my home. For the Gemara, Tavlin Nabuchim Menabach Kalayu. With spices, when they break apart, you hear it as if a ba-boom, ba-boom. So therefore, he knew from the sound of it that actually not crushing spices, they're crushing salt in the normal manner. And he determined that's not my home. Fascinating. Taner Rabbanim. The rabbis taught, Ein oisen tisani. You're not allowed to. Now remember, wheat is very different than spices and salt. Remember, wheat is certainly you're not allowed to crush wheat and make to prepare flour on Yom Tov, even though it's oichel nefesh, because that's usually done commercially. So the Brisa says ein oisen tisani. You're not allowed to crush wheat to make it into 4 parts, to quarters. The ein koitchim b'machteshes. You're not allowed to use a crushing machine on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, that's what the Brisa says. So the Gemara says, Tarte, these two halachas seem to be similar, right? So first you say, first of all, these two halachas don't make sense. First of all, because what's the question? It says don't crush wheat into quarters. What about halves? Crush it in halves. in two parts, that would be permitted. And then it says, don't use a crushing machine. So what is the Bryce trying to say? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. The Bryce is simple. It's one thing. Ma tam ein oisen tisuni. Why can't you crush the wheat into four parts? Because lefish ein koischim b'machteshes. Because you can't use a crushing machine on Yontif. So that's what the Bryce says. So then so Gemara asks, write the Bryce much simpler. V'leime ein koischim b'machteshes. Let the Bryce just simply write that you don't use a crushing machine on Yontif, and I would for sure know that you can't crush wheat into four parts. So, and a crushing machine is usually a big item. So the Gemara says, if it would say you're not allowed to use a big crushing machine, I would have thought you're not allowed to use a big one, right? But to use a small one, to make tisani, like a small one, like a mini machteshes, I would think that's good. Kamash malan, that not only a big one, but even a small one. So ein oisen tisani means you're not allowed to use a small machine. Then kais machteshes, you're not allowed to use a big machine. Again, a wheat is different because wheat is then generally used commercially. You make it, you process it commercially. So even if you're using a small machine, a small crusher, you still wouldn't be allowed to use it to do it on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, V'hatanya, but I have a question. Another Brisa says, when it comes to wheat, you're not allowed to crush it in a big crusher. I could use a small crusher, grinder, because that's because a machteshes katana is like a mini one that's used mostly for spices. It's not used for wheat. So this Brisa seems to permit it, and you tell me that it's aser. Amar Abaye, so Abaye says, Ki tanya nama masnitim machteshes gedoyle ketanya. That you have to learn pshat another way to learn the first Brisa. The first Brisa says you're not allowed to make tisani at all, even with a small one. But you can't use tisani. It means to cut it into quarters. Even with a small one, you can't use. That's what the first Brisa is going to say. Quarters, no good. Let's say you only want to make it into halves. You're not crushing it into quarters, into four parts. You're only crushing it into two parts. Then you can't use a big one, but you could use a small one. So that aligns the two Brises together. You can use a small one if you're crushing the wheat into two parts, but if you're making four parts, you can't use any crushing machine. That's Rabbi's way to answer the two Brises. Let's go to Amud Beis. Rava says, like Kasha, it's not a question. And the truth is that one says you can't use any crushing machine, and one just says you can't use a big one, but a small one you could. What's the difference? Halon. In Halon, v'halahu. By us, we don't, our servants, in other words, where Rava lived in Bavel, they had good domestic help, okay? They had Spanish domestic help. And therefore, this type of people, if you tell them you don't use the big one, only use the small one, they'll listen to you. That's why the second Brisa allows you to use the small one. It's talking about in Bavel, where they had very good domestic help. When did the Brisa say you can't use a small one? It was V'halahu in Israel, where you couldn't get good domestic help. And therefore, their domestic help would be if you tell them you can't use a big one, you can only use a small one, they'll use a big one, and they'll say we use the small one because it's much easier to use a big one. Therefore, in Israel, they asked both a small one and a big one. This problem exists till today. You can't get good domestic help in Israel, but in Bavel you could. Anyway, the Gemara says Rapapi ikla lebei Mar Shmuel. Sometimes in Bavel, you don't even get good domestic help because the Gemara says Rapapi was a guest in Mar Shmuel, Master Shmuel's house. Aisili daisa, they brought him daisa. Now, v'loy achal, he didn't eat it. Now the question is why? V'dilma b'machteshes katana avde. Maybe they made this grits in a small crushing machine, and we just said a small one is permitted. So why did Rapapi, who's a guest in another good rabbi's house, not eat it? So the Gemara says the chavya the have daik. He saw it was very crushed very, very well. That's why he saw that they must have used the big one. So the Gemara says, even if they used the big one, v'dilma me'esmol avdu, how do you know that it was made today? Maybe it was made before Yom Tov. The chazi dahave kilift sihara. He saw that it had a white look. It looked like it was just freshly crushed and looked very fine. So he deduced that it must have been used a big machteshes, and therefore, chumrah-wise, he didn't want to benefit from that and eat that dish on Yom Tov. I don't know how Mar Shmuel ate the dish on Yom Tov, but the guest, Rapapi, did not want to eat it. The Iba is Seima, and if you want, I can tell you, Shani Beimar Shmuel, the Ika Pritzose the Avde. His domestic help did not follow instructions. And therefore, even though Shmuel may have told them only use the small one, Rapapi saw that this is not good domestic help, and probably they crushed it with a big one. So therefore, Rapapi himself, probably a Chumrah, didn't want to eat the food from our Shmuel. Next Mishnah. Again, borer is, let's say you're eating watermelon, right? You know the halachas of eating watermelon on Shabbos. There's a isser of borer, selecting the food from the non-edible part. So the way to do that is to get around borer on Shabbos. If you eat a watermelon, is ayel, aleph, yud, lamed. You take the food from the Pesailis. Yud stands for you have to eat it right away. And Yud means you do it with your hands. You can't use a machine. And Lamed stands, you have to eat it right away. In other words, you can't just have a watermelon in front of you and just pick off the pits. You have to eat it and then spit out the pits. That's on Shabbos. What about Yom Tov? Can you do boirer on Yom Tov? So you can't do boirer on Yom Tov. So therefore, haboirer kitni is Yom Tov. According to Beit Shammai, boirer is just like it's also to do boirer on Shabbos, it's also to do boirer on Yom Tov. So whoever's selecting beans on Yom Tov, and there's like stuff that's not edible, and then there's stuff that is edible. So again, Beit Shammai says you have to do it the way you do it on Shabbos. Boirer, you do it, you take the food part, boirer oichel, you take the food part, and oichel, you eat it right away. Boirer oichel, you take the food from the psilis, without using an implement, without using an instrument, a tool. And you eat it right away. You can't use a sifter or any other item that will help you select the beans, the kidneys. Beis says on Yom Tiv, this is Eichel Nefesh. You can select the way you normally do it during the weekdays. You can do it in your lap and do a lot at a time. These are type of small instruments that allow you to select the beans and separate the beans from the unedible part. But those are small type of instruments. These type of instruments, the tavla is a big table, but nafa is a sifter, kavara is another type of sifter. All these types of things are real kalim that's meant to use large quantities. And you don't want to give the impression on Yom Tiv that you're sifting large quantities of kidneys, because that looks like you're preparing for Yom Tiv for the weekday. So you're only allowed to use the small instruments to help you, but not the big ones. But still, you could use instruments. You could be boirer kedarka, because Beis Hillel holds selecting is permitted on Yom Tiv. And Beis Shammai holds no. Beis Shammai holds boirer is like Shabbos. Rabbi Gamliel says, agrees with Beis Hillel that you could select, but you could do another type of selecting, which looks like it's in large quantities. Af madiach v'shoyle. You're allowed to put the beans in a bowl full of water, and the beans sink to the bottom, and the shell part goes to the top, and that's a nice way to do it. So we learned in the Mishnah. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Amma Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. That's what you're supposed to say. When did Beis Hillel say you're allowed to do selecting? It's when you have more food than the pesailis. So you have the food part is more than the unedible part. Select the food, and then you're allowed to do selection. But if there's more unedible part than the food, divrei hakoil, everybody would agree that what? That you take the food part, ubeniach as a psilis, and you take the psilis part. Because if there's like very little food in there, and this is a pile of shells, you can just pick out the food and that would be fine but if you're going to pick out the psoilus, that's extra work, right? If you pick out the unedible, but there's much more unedible part than the edible part. So in that case, where there's more unedible part and a bowl of unedible part, and there's just a slight things, little beans in there, everybody holds you can take the food and select the food and leave the unedible part. So the Gemara asks on that, if you have a bowl full of psoilus, unedible part, and you have a little bit of food, that becomes muktzah. That's because the oichel gets bottled barayv. It gets nullified. And we look at the whole mixture as one big psoilus. Psoilus murubal oichel. If there's more psoilus, more than the oichel, mikaman the shari. Would there be somebody who says this is permitted? Certainly you can't move it. It's muktzah. Oh, so the Gemara says loy tzricha. The nafesh beturcha v'zuter b'shira. In other words, like this, that really we're talking about where there's more food than psoilus. There's more food than psoilus. So normally, if there's more food than psoilus, what should you do? Take out the psoilus. Take out the psoilus. According to Beis Hillel, take out the psoilus and eat the food. Even though that's boirer. Boirer means taking out psoilus, but that's okay. It's permitted to be done in Yontif because there's more food than psoilus. But that only applies when taking out the psoilus is easy. If it's difficult to take out the psoilus, for example, it's very small and it's a big bother, it's a type of psoilus that's very hard to take out, even though there's more food, then you should do the opposite. Take the food from the psoilus. Even Beis Hillel says, we don't want you to do extra work on Yantif. Rabbi Gamliel, af mediach v'shoila. You put it in a bowl and let the stuff float to the top. Let the psoilus float to the top. Tanya, we learned in Brayso. Amar Ablazer Rab Tzaddik. Kach chayim in Haga shebeis Rabbi Gamliel. This was the custom in the house of Rabbi Gamliel. Shayim avim deli mole Adashem. They would bring a pitcher full of Adashem, is a type of lentils. Umitzifin olav mayim. They would pour water on it, and then what happened is the nimtza oichel amata, the food part sank to the bottom. Upsoilas lamala, and the unedible parts moved to the top. Now, this probably was a deli, is like a big bowl. Even Beis Hillel would not say that's okay because that's in large quantities. But in the house of Rabbi Gamliel, they gave a heter for that. That's permitted. So if the Gemara says V'atanya ibcha, but we learned in another case, we learned in another brisa that says that the psoilus would fall to the bottom and the food would float to the top. So how do you reconcile that? Like kasha, it depends, not a difficulty. Haba afra, dirt. If you try to separate dirt from the lentils, the dirt will float to the bottom and the lentils will float to the top. But ha begili, but if it's dealing with straw or something light shell, right? So then the beans will float, the lentils will float to the bottom and the shell will float to the top. So that's not a difficulty of what's floating to the bottom and what's floating to the top between the two brises. Next, the Mishnah says, Beit Shammai Oimim. Now, Beit Shammai is of the opinion, you can't send somebody a chicken on Yontif. Why can't they send them a whole chicken, not a cooked chicken, but a regular chicken, a live chicken? He could technically slaughter the chicken on Yontif and eat it. Beit Shammai is going to hold you can't send somebody a gift like that or an animal because he's most likely not going to shecht it on Yontif. Therefore, you're preparing him a gift and sending him on Yontif something that he's going to use during the weekdays. So you can't just send somebody a gift. So Beit Shammai says, "Ein mishalchim b'yontiv." You can't send anybody a gift to Yontiv. You can't send them an animal, a bird, or something that you can't readily eat. Elamonos, only a readable item of food that he can eat right now, because if it's something that he could push for after Yontiv to eat, you can't send it. So you can only send them something that's like a piece of potato kugel. That's what you can send them. That's it. You could send a behemoth, an animal, chaya, wild animal, and a bird, even though technically he's probably going to say, I'm going to put it in my barn, I'll use it on another day. And so why are you allowed to send it to him? Why do we allow somebody to send somebody a gift like that? Because at the end of the day, when somebody receives a gift, he's very happy. And that brings simchas yontiv. So therefore, Beis Hillel allowed that. And you're allowed to sell an animal, ben chaim, a live animal, ben shchutin, slaughtered animals. Mishalchin, you're allowed to send yainis, wine, shmonim, oil, slosses, and flour, even though he's not going to use it over yontiv. The kidneys and beans. Aval, but the one thing even Beis Hillel says you can't send on yontiv, loy tvua. You can't send them wheat. or grains on Yontif, because you send him a whole pile of wheat. There's nothing he can do on Yontif. He can't crush it and make flour out of it. So certainly that's not permitted. But something only, according to Basila, it technically is a possibility that it can use it on Yontif. That's the rule. If he cannot use it on Yontif at all, then you're not allowed to even send him that. Rab Shimon mata betvua. Rab Shimon allows people to send tvua, grains as a present for somebody. So you have three opinions. Beis Shammai is most strict. He says you could only send like a regular food that he can eat right now, like a sandwich or a kugel. Beis Hillel says you can send him a live animal, even though possibility he's going to use it after Yontif, and not wheat. And Rab Shimon says you can send him raw wheat. Tana Rav Chiel. We learned that the Rav Chiel taught when you send somebody a gift, the way they used to send a gift, they would have sometimes a few people bring over the gift. So if you're trying to send your friend a gift on Yontif, don't send it with a lot of people, because it looks like you're sending these items to be sold in the marketplace. So that's what we don't send them with a group of people. You send them with one friend, you send them a gift, but don't send your three kids to send them with the present. Tana, we learned in a brayso, ain't sure don't send a group is not less than three people. Ravashi, what happens? You're sending Tlosagabri, you're sending your three kids, or you're sending your three friends to bring a present to somebody, but each one is holding another item of food. And each one holding a different item of food. One is holding apples, one is holding an animal, one is holding oil. So, is that permitted? You're sending three people, but they're carrying nonetheless three different items of food. That's an unresolved question. Rav Shimon mata betvua. Why did Rav Shimon say you can send wheat? What could you do with wheat on grains? What could you do with grains on Yontif? Tanya, we learned to Rav Shimon mata betvua. Rav Shimon allowed you to send a gift to somebody of tvua. Why? Kegoin chitim, like wheat, because lasas ludius. There's a dish called ludius where you could cook up a little bit of wheat, raw wheat, and it's somehow edible. You can make that edible. So you could send somebody barley, lifnei beheita, because on Yontif he could give it to his animal. So there is a use for it on Yontif. Adashem, he could send them lentil. Lasamam resisim, he can make this dish called resisim. So since technically, usually wheat and adashem, lentils and barley is always grounded and made into flour, but since sometimes you could use wheat and barley and lentils for individual dishes, Rab Shimon allowed you to send that tvua, that type of grains, as a present for somebody on Yontif. The Mishnah continues that according to Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai says you can't send anything, but Beis Hillel says you could send gifts to people on Yontif. Mishalchen Kalim, you're allowed to send a gift for somebody on Yontif, items of clothing, bein tefurim, whether it's sewed up island like a suit. You can send them just a roll of fabric on Yontif. Even though there is kalayim there, and so what is he going to do with kalayim? The Gemara is going to talk about that. So you're allowed to send them fabric or a suit of kalayim. The reason of all this is because when you receive a gift, you become happier, even though you're not necessarily going to use it on Yontif. You become happier. That's why Beis Hillel allowed you to send gifts on Yontif. But on Yontif, you're not allowed to send loy sandal hamasumer. You're not allowed to send a spiked shoe, like a baseball, what they wear in baseball, those spikes coming out of the shoe, because he can't put them on Yontif. There was, if you remember in Masechta Shabbos, a gezerah that you should not wear sandal hamasumer, spiked shoes on Shabbos, because one time there was a group of Jews hiding out in a cave. And what happened was they heard steps coming up on top of them, and they got scared that the Romans are going to find their hideout. So they trampled each other. And because everybody was wearing these spiked shoes, people got killed. It was like a stampede. So because of that story, they made a new gezerah that nobody's allowed to wear a spiked shoe on Shabbos or Yom Tov. For that reason, because it's unusable on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you can't send that as a gift. V'loy minol she'eina tofor, and you're not allowed to send a shoe that's not sewn on Yom Tov because it's unprepared. It's a shoe that you can't use. It's not put together correctly. Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to send a white shoe because nobody wears white shoe. And you need a craftsman to finish it off to make it black. That's Zahaklo. If there's a possibility you could benefit on it for Yontif, it's usable on Yontif, you could send it. 1 more minute. So let's just finish up the Gemara to the top of the next page. Bishlam Tefurim. I understand why you can send a suit. Chazal Malbish. The person could put it on. He could put it on Yontif. Shein Tefurim Nama. You could send him a roll of fabric. Chazi Lekasuyi. He could use it as a bedspread. Ela Kalayim. The Mishnah said you could send him Kalayim, like a fabric made of wool or linen. He can't use it on Yontif. Lamai Chazi. What could he use it for? Would you say Chazi Lamesach to say he could sit on it? Well, Tanya, we learned that a brisa. Lo yala lecha. You're not allowed to put shatnez at all on you. You technically can't sit on it. You're not allowed to sit on it because maybe a thread will come up and it'll just wrap around your body and warm you up. So therefore, you're not midrabanan. You're not allowed to sit on kalayim. So do you want to? So therefore, what could you use this fabric of kalayim? You're going to put like another thing in between you, like a piece of plastic that separates you from the kalayim, and then you use it as something to sit on. That wouldn't work either. All these people say this, that kalayim afile esem atzoy zu al gabe zu. You have 10 mattresses, one on top of another, and just a piece of fabric of kalayim underneath. Also, you're not allowed to sleep on it because it's a gzeira d'rabbanan. So you're not allowed. What could you use kalayim for? So why are you allowed to send kalayim, a fabric of kalayim, to your friend on Yontif? What could he use it for on Yontif? Elul bevilon. Do you want to say that he could use it as a curtain? You still can't use a kalayim as a curtain. A vilain, a curtain, is not like a wall, which cannot be mekabel tuma. It could be mekabel tuma, a curtain, because sometimes a servant in the house will wrap himself in the curtain to warm himself up. So it's something that people warm themselves up for. And therefore, you're not allowed to use kalayim as a curtain in your house. So again, what was the Mishnah says you could send kalayim to your friend. What can he use it for? So the Gemara says, yes, you can send kalayim to your friend. Ella b'koshin, we're talking about a kalayim that's very hard, that do not provide heat. It's like harder, like plastic. And therefore, if it's treated kalayim, then you're allowed to sit on it. This clothing of shatnez, which is very hard, the Neresh from the city of Neresh, probably it had kalayim. Sharia, it's permitted to sit on it because it doesn't warm you up. Amar Papa said, "Adilin ein behem mishim kalayim." These things have no. These things don't have any kalayim on it because it's something that they would put on their shoes, like a felt or something like that, and therefore it was hard. It was hard. It doesn't have kalayim. Then one more piece of the Gemara. Amar Rava said, These bege kalayim that they wrap money into it, you're allowed to put it into your pocket because the money inside it hardens the material and it doesn't provide warmth. The barzine, that you put wheat in there, you put seeds in there, these pouches that you put seeds in it, yesh b'hem shim kalayim. It's a type of wallet that would have a problem of kalayim. Rav Ashi Amar, echad zeh ve'echad zeh ein b'hem shim kalayim, because wallets, ein behem b'shim kalayim, you have no problem with kalayim, lefi she'ein derech chimim b'kach, because that's not the normal way to warm yourself up, by putting a wallet in your pocket. So, okay, so therefore, that's just a side point. The point that we brought this whole thing, that when you learn the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says you're allowed to send to your friend an item of fabric that even if it has kalayim on it, what's he going to use it for? It's not any kalayim. It's kalayim that's hard and doesn't provide any warmth. If it doesn't provide any warmth, then he could actually sit on it because there's no isser midrabanan to sit on such kalayim.
Baruch, it's amazing, just the idea of, it's so important because the separates Yom Tov and Shabbos is these Ach Sameach.
Right.
And that's why they allow preparation of food. And yet Hillel is on board, but and Shammai, I mean, it kind of like limits people to, like, for instance, especially those days, you want to prepare fish. Your fish
Right.
had bones in it. And in other words, you couldn't separate the bones from the fish, according
Right.
to Beit Shammai, right?
Right. Right. The
It
Gemara
limits a
Gemara is
lot of things for them. I mean, the basic kugel and gefilte fish.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult those days. I
Right.
mean, really. So I don't understand the concept. I mean, it was really machmir on this particular thing.
The Gemara mentioned something like that before, that Beis Shammai had that like strictness when it comes to Simchas Yantiv, would not even override any Issa D'Rabbanans.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
borer, I mean, that knocks out a lot of preparation of food.
Right. Beis Hillel says Boira Kedarkoi. He says do it normally.
Yeah. Yep.
This whole parak is only Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. It's a way to remember this difficult, different topics in this parak.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel.
Okay. Shkoyach.
I just want to wish
Wonderful.
everybody a Gemara Chasima Tova. Gemara stands for Gashmias mit Ruchnias. So you have to have all
Thank
everything,
you so much.
everything
You
that
too,
you're.
Baruch.
I
Thank
think
you very
maybe
much.
if maybe we'll learn Sunday, maybe we'll not. We'll learn Sunday, and if not, then maybe we'll pick it up in Mitzvah Shem after Sukkot. So maybe if anybody's around, we can learn Sunday night. If
Okay.
everybody-
Okay.
and that's it. And then
Okay,
we'll
be in
take off
touch.
for Sukkot.
Gemara Chazim Tov to
Machzeva,
everyone.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Take care.